in terms of the Conservative Party and its psychology, what do you think it's thinking about its future at the moment?
It ought to be more depressed than it is. 121 members of Parliament, worst result ever, politics fracturing, reform on one side, the Lib Dems eating away at its vote in the home counties.
Parts of the party will be unhappy with this as a final two. If you are a One Nation Tory, this is not what you wanted.
I'm also delighted that Theresa May will be the next Prime Minister. She is strong, she is competent, she's more than able to provide the leadership that our country is going to need in the years ahead, and she will have my full support.
And therefore I give notice that Boris Johnson is elected as the leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party.
Therefore, I give notice that Liz Truss is elected as the leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party. And Rishi Sunak is therefore elected as leader of the Conservative.
Following this result, I will step down as party leader, not immediately, but once the formal arrangements for selecting my successor are in place.
They've become so familiar, haven't they? Part of the rhythm of our lives. There's the Olympics, Wimbledon, Crufts, and the nearly annual Conservative Party leadership contest. We are on day 112 of the most recent one, and hey, as far as I'm concerned, who's counting? Given, in a genius PR move from central office, the results come on November the 2nd, sandwiched in between, well, the budget and, checks notes, the US presidential election, it is just possible that the news on the result itself gets rather squeezed. So before we get distracted by two behemoths of news to come, foreign and domestic, we thought we'd look at Badenoch and Jenrick, a closer profile in political power. Who are they? What do they believe? And what would they do differently to the Conservative Party, enfeebled, beleaguered, but still just about the alternative government in this country? What, whisper it, would they be like, not just as leader of the opposition, but Prime Minister? Welcome to the Newsagents.
We are picking a party leader who is going to get us out of the mess we are in. If we get this wrong, we will not have a party. We need to pick a leader with integrity. We need to pick a leader with conviction. We need to pick a leader who has been consistent, who has clarity.
I want to cap legal migration. My opponent won't say that. I want to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. She doesn't want to do that, or won't say so today. So it's a promise of a plan tomorrow versus an actual plan today.
First things first, this is an unusual Conservative contest in that it is comprised of two candidates of the right, and that doesn't usually happen. Normally, there's, broadly speaking, a One Nation candidate of the party's slightly soggy left, and one of the right, and typically the one at least perceived to be on the right wins. Now, with James cleverly knocked out, possibly accidentally by MPs trying to ensure that one or other of Badenoch and Jenrick didn't make it through, we have two flavours of right-wing tasty, which you might be amazed to hear is going down pretty well with Tory party members. Katie Balls is the political editor of The Spectator and knows the Conservative Party inside out.
So I think parts of the party will be unhappy with this as a final two. If you are a One Nation Tory, this is not what you wanted. And I think that lots of the One Nation Tories and perhaps centrist Tory MPs are slightly kicking themselves as to how they stopped, or you end up in a situation where James cleverly did not make it to the final two. The margins were so tight. All three candidates effectively got about a third of the parliamentary party. So did people get a bit too clever by half to try and stop their least favourite right-winger being in the final two? Then you end up with both. But at the same time, I think that if you think about the Tory membership and recent leadership changes, the Tory grassroots have wanted the party to move to the right, and has felt as though they have not been given options for several years now. Boris Johnson was pushed out against the sentiments of the Tory membership. It was MPs doing that. They then rejected Rishi Sunak and they picked Liz Truss, and then MPs decided to get rid of Liz Truss. Now, I'm sure listeners will be saying, well, they had to get rid of Liz Truss because of the mini budget. But I think the perspective amongst parts of the membership is they just had various candidates thrust on them, even those that they have rejected, and therefore they wanted to have a choice of their favourites. So I think probably the Tory membership as a whole, doesn't speak for everyone, is more happy with the final two than parts of the parliamentary party.
But who are they? Well, let's start with this man.
So the choices: leave or remain. Leave and get foreign terrorists and criminals off our streets, end illegal migration, finish what Brexit started, and restore sovereignty to our people and our parliament. And the nation of Magna Carta, habeas corpus, the Bill of Rights, protecting and enhancing our own freedoms, or remain and let the madness continue. So I'm for leave. What about you?
That is, of course, Robert Jenrick, occasionally, perhaps unfairly nicknamed Robert Generic, an almost off-the-shelf looking and sounding Conservative politician, a theme to which we'll return. But until the last year or so, it wasn't completely unfair. He'd sort of risen without trace. Elected as MP for Newark in a by-election in 2014, he steadily rose through the ranks, a rising, if not electrically bright, star. If anything, he was best known for his career nearly reaching a premature end, when as Boris Johnson's Housing Secretary, he controversially granted planning permission for a £1 billion property scheme 2 weeks before the owner, media tycoon Richard Desmond, sat next to Jenrick at a Conservative Party fundraiser where he donated £12,000 to party funds. Now, Jenrick always denied impropriety, but he did come close to the political precipice.
Contrary to the wild accusations and the baseless innuendo propagated by the honourable gentleman opposite and restated today in a series of totally inaccurate statements and comments, this was a decision taken with an open mind on the merits of...
But of course, he survived it. Probably didn't hurt that he was a close friend of Carrie Johnson's. He was part of a set of rising young Tory things with Rishi Sunak and Oliver Dowden. They, of course, slowly left behind their old friend in the dust. But Jenrick eventually had, as they say, a breakout moment, which has propelled him to the position he now enjoys on the edge of internal Tory power. Aggie Chambray is, of course, LBC political correspondent and is talking us through the biographies of these Tory pretenders. So who is he? Who is
Robert Jenrick? Well, who is he is actually a more difficult question than you might have anticipated, because I think he has changed.
He's not been leading a double life, has he?
He's not been, not so far as I know. That'd be a great scoop.
Great story.
Yeah. But he basically started off his political career as a kind of one nation Tory. He wasn't particularly well known when he became a junior minister, and he was viewed as this sort of Robert Generic, as he was unfairly nicknamed, figure. And people say that was partly because he became a junior minister so quickly, and when you become a junior minister and then a cabinet minister, you are bound by collective responsibility. So it's much harder to kind of show off who you are, show off your responsibility. But I think also it was that he was viewed as this kind of one nation, slightly generic person.
Like he'd back Cameron, he's moved his way through the party.
He had backed Cameroon. He was a core Cameroon, a core Borisite, a core Rishiite, and then to some extent he was also in Liz Truss's government. And he was famously, he was someone who went in with Oliver Dowden, now the Deputy Conservative leader, and Rishi Sunak, of course, the Tory leader. And those three went in and met Boris Johnson in 2019 and basically asked him loads of questions, asked him about Brexit, and then decided, okay, this is the guy we're going to back. And they were all these kind of fresh-paced.
Theresa May had stepped down.
This is when Theresa May had stepped down, and they were all these kind of fresh-faced new intake, and they wrote this three-headed piece for the Times, and that was seen as quite a big deal at the time, that they put their weight behind Boris Johnson.
The future of the Tory party.
The future of the Tory party, indeed. So then he became sort of, well, the way it's been billed and the way he does not deny this, I've actually asked him about this in a press conference and he didn't deny it. He became essentially radicalised by the Home Office when he was immigration minister under Rishi Sunak.
Home Office usually tries to act against radicalisation, of course, but this was a different sort of...
Well, yes, this was a different sort.
We shouldn't refer to the Prevent programme or anything.
Indeed. Okay, so he basically gets sent in to the Home Office, and the narrative at the time was, the briefing out of Number 10 at the time was that he was kind of being sent in there to spy on Suella Braverman, who was then Home Secretary.
Because he was such a close ally of Sunak.
Because they were best mates, right?
Yeah.
They'd written this three-headed piece for the Times. They were seen as the future of the Conservative Party. And And he was sent into the Home Office to spy on Suella Braverman, who was seen as a bit of a wild card. Now, his team deny that. They say that really wasn't the case. And they say he's known Suella Braverman for 25 years. They were always close. But in any case, I think what no one denies is when he got into the Home Office, there were all these kind of red flashing lights. There was very high levels of migration at the time. It was during, do you remember the Manston Migration Centre? Huge problems over that. Lots of problems. And he basically looked around, thought, what's going on? And became way more hardcore on migration. And I think his entire political persona very much shifted to the right.
This is doubtless the key event in Jenrick's political trajectory. His resignation from Rishi Sunak's government, his alleged radicalisation.
But it was at the Home Office that my perspective changed the most. And I saw that the most basic duty of the British state to keep us safe and to protect our borders was being failed on a daily basis. And I saw there was a failed economic model of mass migration where hundreds of thousands of people were coming into our country, placing enormous pressure on housing, public services, community cohesion. It was diminishing public trust. And I took the view over time that the British political system was not only failing, but was fundamentally broken.
He claims that seeing the Home Office on the inside changed him. A little, as Tony Benn said, seeing ministerial life radicalised him, albeit in a very different direction back in the 1960s and 70s. Both Jenrick and Badenoch actually speak in quite a Bennite way, talking of the need to rewire the state to ensure democratic accountability. They say that ministers don't really have the power, but we're going to return to that theme in a bit. For now, what matters is that after his resignation, Jenrick started slowly but surely to amass a power base on the party's right, critiquing government policy, shifting to become a standard bearer of a faction that was not always his own. And it has led him down a very particular path to indeed his signature flagship policy.
Our continued membership of the European Convention on Human Rights is making it impossible for us to deport terrorists who are here walking our streets, to remove dangerous foreign criminals like rapists and murderers and paedophiles who we need to get out of our country to protect the public. It is making it impossible to secure our borders, which is the first duty of the British state. And it is making it impossible for us to finish the job we began with Brexit, which is to restore sovereignty to our people and our parliament. That's what we need to do.
The former Remainer, Jenrick, claims that the only way to assert true control of its borders, its true sovereignty, is for Britain to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. He has no real answer as to how this could be done, of course, given our membership is baked into our Good Friday Agreement obligations. But in that sense, he follows a clear line of Tory leaders, centrist Tory leaders, once centrist Tory leaders, giving way to an impractical but politically powerful bit of catnip to the Tory right. But there is little doubt that it is deeply controversial, even within the Tory party, and would probably, to some extent, destabilise it, even in opposition. And though it is an assumption that perhaps Jenrick is doing a Keir Starmer, tacking right before tacking centre in his case, but this is a bit of a superficial reading which doesn't pay enough attention, not only to Jenrick and his trajectory, but to the internal dynamics of Tory party power as it now stands, as Katie Balls explains.
Then you have Robert Jenrick, and I think as the campaign has gone on, it's become increasingly clear that the bulk of his support is coming from the right of the party, and that's much more the old Tory right. So Mark Francois, you have Danny Kruger, who was in the New Conservatives, but I mentioned the five families earlier, and
this was just to remind people. This was not that we're in danger of becoming too arcane on these things, but this was the kind of divisions within the sort of right of the Conservative Party that was talked about kind of a year or two ago, and basically, and although they agree on a lot, they have various different emphases
Yeah,
in terms of what they
it was basically
believe.
all these little Tory pressure groups
Little
that made
splinter
Rishi
groups.
Sunak's life a misery. Whether it was a European research group that were very powerful during the Brexit years, now a lot less powerful, of course. It was the New Conservatives, who were arguing for listening more to red wall voters, and it was just parts of the Tory right. You had the Common Sense group that were more anti-woke.
Not that it's People's Front of Judea, Judean People's Front or anything like that.
But they were pretty similar in,
Yeah.
in lots of ways. And Robert Jenrick has effectively got so far because he has much of the old Tory right and some of the new Tory right getting behind him. And then you have a few surprise figures. He has Victoria Atkins, who is a One Nation Tory backing him. He has Ed Argar, who's seen as someone in the middle of the party. But generally speaking, his support is much more from one place, which is why when people say, oh, would Robert Jenrick do a Keir Starmer if he got in, and effectively tack to the right to win over, the membership to get there and then move more to the centre, I think that'd be tricky to do because so much of his MP support comes from one part of the party. The general journey of the Tory party, which is moving to a harder position when it comes to migration, immigration, he is part of a trend. And that is partly because some of the solutions the Tory government has tried in recent years have not led to results. So I don't think it's completely inauthentic. I guess the question is everything he's saying at the moment what he genuinely believes, or is part of that saying this is what the campaign think he should say to help get that reform vote, which happens to all politicians. But I think at the very least, I think the Home Office was a radicalising experience for him.
But leaving aside the politics, what about the personality? What's he like?
So I think Robert Jenrick really wants to make this point, and his team around him really want to make the point that he, grew up working class. His dad was a gas engineer and a fireplace fitter. His mum was a secretary, and his dad started a small business. They actually weren't conservatives. I don't think they particularly talked about politics around the kitchen table when he was growing up, but worked really, really hard. He said he has these memories of during his childhood years, his dad kind of going outside and cutting marble in the garden because he was a fireplace fitter. And he did go to a private school. He went to the private local grammar school, but he says that he only went there because his grandma lost her husband, his granddad, and the life insurance money they used to pay for his private education. So I think he is trying to make this point now that he did come from humble beginnings, and hasn't always been surrounded by lots of money. I think his parents are now more successful. I'm told by lots of people, it seems pretty consistent across the Conservative Party, that he's pretty nice, pretty sharp. No one's described him as funny, which is always a bit of a red flag for me.
Well, that's very much like John Sopel, of course. No one's ever described him as funny.
But I think he's well liked. Lots of people are quite loyal to him. He's still very close to his family. Apparently his mum is worried about how little sleep he's getting. I mean, it's interesting. He obviously takes what people say to him really on board. So one of the things that someone said to me was that a Tory grandee said to him when he was first elected that it was really important when he was in the Commons to see it as political theatre. He shouldn't ask questions off a piece of paper. He should just learn his questions and learn his speeches. So now that's one of the things people say about him. He never, ever, ever reads speeches off notes. He always memorises speeches, and he's kind of seen as quite a good performer in that sense. But I think in terms of listening to what people say, that goes further. He speaks to people a lot about ideas. At the moment, people say he sort of speaks to the Danny Krugers, people very much on the right of the party, and that's where he's currently getting his ideas from. That's the charge, at least. And I think, someone told me that when he has an idea about something or when he's decided on something, he'll go around a room and ask everybody what they think, and then at the end he'll sort of reveal what he thinks. So I think he listens to people, he's open to changing his mind.
That much is clear. And for former editor of Conservative Home, Paul Goodman, now a Conservative peer himself, it is a potential problem.
He's very proficient, very articulate, intelligent, able, quick, and I think maybe rather surprised to find himself on the journey that he's gone on. I should add, I can't think, maybe you'll be able to correct me, I think it's quite hard for politicians to reinvent themselves. They're not David Bowie, who can be the thin white duke one moment and something else the next, and everybody loves it. It's quite hard for a politician to change because the voters and anyone looking on tend to say, well, hey, if you believe that now, why didn't you believe it last week? I think this is the problem Michael Portillo ran into in 2001. I can't think of a politician in modern times who's shifted their worldview fundamentally and has made it work for them. I think he would run a sort of tighter and more usual kind of ship as Conservative leader. The difficulty for him would be getting the sort of cut through that Kemi Badenoch gets. I think a problem for him, in a sense, is that frankly he looks a bit like me. In other words, he's a middle-aged or more man who looks like a conventional Tory. He's not going to make people look at the Tories in a new way.
This is an idea the Jenrick campaign has been so eager to reject because they know it cuts close to the bone.
I didn't come from a traditional Conservative background. Neither of my parents were card-carrying members of the Conservative Party. What I want to do is represent working people.
You're not
in
a Tory
all parts
boy?
of the country. I don't consider myself to be a Tory boy, no, absolutely. Okay. I want the Conservative Party to be the trade union of working people.
There is no doubt that Jenrick has run a slick professional campaign, and we shouldn't write him off. He's doing tons of media, outreach, and is by common agreement Stakhanovite, a hard worker. But if he were to pull it off, beyond certainly a leadership which would be defined by immigration and an attempt to, in many ways, steal Nigel Farage's clothes, his biggest danger is that he feels quite familiar. Luke Trill from Polestar Mooring Common has been running focus groups on Jenrick and Badenoch. This is his verdict, or rather, his focus group's verdict on the former.
Rob Jenrick, I think, has more challenges from a first impressions perspective than Kemi Badenoch. That's because whilst people, when we've shown clips of Rob in focus groups, people sometimes like what he has to say. Some people agree with him on the ECHR. Some people disagree with him on the ECHR. But, some of the stuff that he talks around about house building, around how we get the NHS working again, people like. But there's a big distinction between the fact that they sometimes like the message, but they don't like the messenger. And I think Robert Jenrick suffers from two things based on the feedback that we've had from the focus groups. And the first is that he sort of comes across like people expect a Tory to come across, which of course is very different to how Kemi Badenoch might come across. So you do get comments like, oh, typical Tory, isn't he just more of the same? Is he any different to what we've had before? But there's also something, and I don't want to sound uncharitable, this is the feedback from the focus groups, that people find maybe a bit smarmy or slimy about him. In fact, I sort of made me think of Anne Widdecombe's description of Michael Howard as having something of the night about it. I think that charge could be applied to Robert Jenrick, and if he became leader, it might well be the case that he has to be the ideas person leading on the message, and he has to use his shadow cabinet to do more of the messaging and communicating with the public.
There can be no doubt about Jenrick's ambition. There can also be no doubt that his opponent, Kemi Badenoch, might be able to have a fight with herself in a paper bag, of which more in a moment. Stay with us.
Until we wake up and Kemi Badenoch doesn't exist anymore, I don't wish ill of her, I just wish her to shut up.
No, I will not shut up. When you have that type of cultural establishment trying to keep Conservatives down, you need someone like me who's not afraid of Doctor Who or whoever, and who's going to take the fight to them and not let them try and keep us down. That's not going to happen with me.
Well, there can't be many leadership campaigns which launch with a searing attack on one of the nation's most beloved actors, but somehow Kemi Badenoch managed to do it. There can't have been many maiden speeches which contained a sentence like this either.
As Woody Allen said about sex, if it's not messy, you're not doing it right. Madam Deputy Speaker, the same is true. The same is true for democracy.
But then Badenoch is not a typical politician. Certainly not a typical candidate to be Tory leaders, and to her supporters, that is part of her appeal.
Kemi Badenoch's strength is the unexpected. You wouldn't normally, though mind you, the Conservative Party does specialise in producing leaders you might not expect. You wouldn't normally expect a black woman born abroad to be leader of the Conservative Party. And she would bring to it, in terms of strengths, a kind of fearlessness, an ability to speak her mind, a tendency to be able to cut through and to make the news. That would be the upside. The downside, according to her detractors, would be that she doesn't always, they claim, put the hours in. It's certainly true, as many people can attest, that she's not afraid of a fight. And it might be that the voters would either think, hey, this is great, here's someone who can cut through and talk to us directly, rather as sort of Boris Johnson could, or a sort of Labour politician like John Prescott or Angela Rayner could. They might like that. Equally, they might just get tired of someone who they felt was that loud and noisy.
Badenoch certainly has a remarkable backstory. She was born in the UK, but as she herself says, she's for all intents and purposes a migrant, having left for Nigeria as a young girl and returning as a teenager. And although it's something she doesn't want to major on, her background, if not her race, led her ostensibly, improbably, but she says inexorably, to conservatism.
I think she has a strong sense in her mind of what is right and wrong, and I think it's quite instinctive. So she did very briefly work at The Spectator, but not in the editorial team. But also I had her on my podcast a few years ago, and I think that one of the things she talked about was when she was at university, she felt it was very patronising how lots of the students were talking about Africa. Now, of course, she is from Nigeria. And I think that's one of the reasons she feels very strongly on things like empire and how the UK talks about itself as a country. In terms of what propels her, I think that she is someone who wants to change the country in a way that she thinks would improve it. What does that look like? I think that probably coming from Nigeria, where she grew up in a pretty wealthy background, but then came to the UK. Of course, she famously said she became working class in the UK because she worked at McDonald's. But I think that was really an eye-opening time for her, because you go from, seeing a country where you grew up massively change, in her view, through policies and politicians doing the wrong thing, and then coming to the UK where she felt there was a new chapter, a new opportunity.
Well, she talks about growing up in a socialist country, doesn't she? And seeing what that was like and having first-hand experience of it, and then coming to a non-socialist country and that being in some way that lifting the scales from her eyes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when she grew up initially in Nigeria, it was one type of place to live, and then she saw it drastically change. And that is something that has had a really big experience, because she thinks that the UK, where she brings up her children now, has so many more opportunities than she would have had back then. So I think that does really lay a foundation to how she sees the world.
She is undoubtedly a politician who likes to approach politics from first principles. In this, she likes to, in a not so subtle fashion, compare herself to another conviction politician for whom the Tory grassroots still yearn. Margaret Thatcher, of course. She says that she was an engineer before politics, and Britain needs to be rewired.
I am an engineer by training. So I studied engineering at university, and I worked as a systems analyst in many industries, from tech to banking. And it was something that I love and still do love. I do miss bits of that old life, because it was about fixing things. So I love fixing things. I can't see something and leave it alone.
This is perhaps the biggest difference conceptually between Badenoch and Jenrick. Both start from a position, perhaps bizarrely, that the last Conservative government was not Conservative enough. In this, again, the Tory party resembles the Labour Party in the 1980s, rejecting and eschewing its most recent government as not being true enough to itself and its party's values as a diagnosis of its electoral and political failure. But that analysis manifests itself slightly differently between Jenrick and Badenoch. Jenrick has answered the problem with quite a few policy solutions, which he believes would make the next Tory government more conservative. Badenoch is different. She hasn't proposed much policy at all. Her analysis is that the state itself is either useless and needs to be reworked, or developing a theme which is pretty Trussite, is wired against conservative values. Ergo, it needs to be fundamentally reformed or purged. That's also one of the reasons she's leaned so hard into culture war issues, because she's convinced that the liberal left, which dominates society in her view, must be fought. Tories just love how clear-eyed she is on this stuff, how she articulates what they want to hear. In this, her race and sex actually helps her with Tory members rather than hinders, because she uniquely can say the things they want to say, but perhaps have been too afraid to do so. The downside of that clarity, though, that forthrightness, is that she can become trapped by her own hand, her own mind. Margaret Thatcher used to say that Enoch Powell, of whom she was fond, was trapped by the remorselessness of his own logic. There is something of that too in Badenoch, which is why she ends up in spats like she did on maternity pay at the Tory party conference.
It is a function of tax. Tax comes from people who are working. We're taking from one group of people and giving to another. This, in my view, is excessive. Businesses are closing. Businesses are not starting in the UK because they say that the burden of regulation is too high.
So maternity pay is excessive.
I think it's gone too far the other way in terms of general business regulation. We need to allow businesses, especially small businesses, to make more of their own decisions.
But her stridency, her combativeness, can in fact obscure or occlude us from the fact that, compared to Jenrick, she's actually been a little less dogmatic sometimes in both what she's done and said.
So I think she's definitely combative. And I don't think she sometimes realises how others might take it, because it's just so in her personality. And therefore, you have a situation where it might be Kemi being Kemi, for example, but to someone who doesn't know her particularly well, they just think, why have I just been massively snubbed by my colleague when I was asking a question? So is it unnecessary at times? That's certainly the perception of some colleagues in the Tory party. The issue is, in some ways, it's what people really like about her. It's why people think she is refreshing and authentic. So what is to some her biggest weakness is also to others why she gets all these Thatcher comparisons. This idea she's the Iron Lady, she's not for turning. Yeah. And to the point earlier about, is she super to the right? I mean, Kemi Badenoch, yes, has gone after The Guardian when she said, these are all rubbish stories about me allegedly bullying staff, and gone toe-to-toe. But she's also really torn, holes in the ERG, the European Research Group of Tory Brexiteers. When she was business secretary, she did what... There were several previous business secretaries who looked at the idea of rolling back EU regulations, this bonfire, and thought it's actually probably a bit more complicated than we said it was. It was Kemi Badenoch who stood at the dispatch box and said, I know you all don't like it and you're going to go all brief to the Telegraph, but we're doing this and this is a sensible thing to do.
She refused to do that great withdrawal or
exactly.
repeal all of those laws because she said it just wouldn't work. And and she's paid something of a price, didn't she, with the right of the Conservative Party? They still haven't forgiven her some of it.
Exactly. And you have Kemi Badenoch who backed Brexit, but she was willing to also say to some of the Brexiteers on the right of the party, you're being too idealistic, this isn't practical. And some of those are now backing Robert Jenrick, who of course didn't back Brexit, but is much more talking about, not making compromises on various things. So I think in that way she is more of a pragmatic politician than some of the others, and perhaps more of a realist.
One area where she does not enjoy any reputation for pragmatism at all is with the media.
Yeah, I think this is going to be really interesting if Kemi Badenoch becomes leader of opposition, to put it mildly, because we know that Kemi Badenoch is quite sceptical of lots of media organisations. She is very quick to take to social media to tear down stories or to criticise reports. And ultimately, a leader of the opposition needs to be in a position where they can actually go and make noise. Now, it might be that Kemi Badenoch has enough media interest that she can say one thing and everyone follows it anyway. But opposition of 121 MPs is going to be a lonely crusade. And I think some in Labour almost relished not all parts of a Kemi Badenoch Tory leadership, but one part they do would be her relationship with the media and whether she's willing to play the game, which some politicians come in saying, I'm not going to do what the media wants or dance to their tune. And they slowly realise that it's much harder to change the system. And you do need to keep the press on side in various ways. And I think when you speak to backers of Kemi Badenoch, this is probably one of the things they're more worried about. They think PMQs, Prime Minister's questions going up against Keir Starmer will be great. She'll put him under pressure. They think that she will have good ideas and she will create a good team. But the media management, that is definitely a cause of concern.
This, for me, is the biggest question hanging over Badenoch. This audition, this prolonged job interview, the prize, if that's the right word, is for the job of leader of the opposition. It requires a very particular, very supple set of political skills. Everything we know about Badenoch probably suggests that she doesn't have at least some of the most important ones, at least right now. But then it feels that if she could conquer them, she might be the more formidable of the two, the candidate with the most room to grow. Certainly the one who, knowing so much, so clearly of what she thinks, could perhaps throw a more formless government, and Starmer in particular, furthest off course. Here's Luke Trill with, for what it's worth, his focus group's assessment.
There's no doubt Kemi Badenoch has something that makes people want to listen to her. The common response we've got across those focus groups when people see clips of Kemi, whether it's at her launch, whether it's in Parliament, or most recently in her conference speech, is that she's refreshing, she's energetic, and interestingly, she seems honest to people as well. One of the interesting things was we also put some of both the candidates' more controversial comments to the focus groups just to see if they changed opinions. The interesting thing was, when we spoke to people about Kemi's comments on, locking up 5 to 10% of civil servants, or that they should be in prison, it didn't really move the group, nor really did her comments around maternity pay. So I think from a first impression, actually Kemi does very well. And, for a party that has 121 MPs and is going to struggle to get a hearing, the fact that people want to hear more and are engaged, I actually think is going to be a real benefit. The flip side of that, and of course this is something you can't test in a focus group because people have to get to know the candidate over time, is we know that the public are quite exhausted, and were particularly exhausted at the end of the last government with the sense of too much noise and drama in politics. And the risk could be that that same audience who said they want to hear more from Kemi Badenoch, if she was leader and there was a sense that there was too much of the sort of, more divisive comments, or comments which, attract a lot of coverage, people might go off her. But she certainly, from a starting perspective, has a big advantage.
One thing is for sure. The Tory party still feels shell-shocked to me. It hasn't internalised its profound failure at the election, its worst in history. In terms of the Conservative Party and its psychology, what condition do you think it's in at the moment? Well, in terms of its health, I mean, the Conservative Party conference, slightly odd event. What do you think it's thinking about its future at the moment?
It ought to be more depressed than it is. 121 members of Parliament, worst result ever, politics fracturing, reform on one side, the Lib Dems eating away at its vote in the home counties. But it is surprisingly chipper, and I think the reason for that, first, it's winning a lot of local government by-elections, and they tend to get your tail up when you're in opposition. But I think there's a sense in which the fracturing can also potentially be helpful to them as well as harmful, because they're looking at a government with this enormous majority, but that only won 34% and was grossly overstated by the polls. I think there's sort of something in the Conservatives somewhere that is hoping that people wanted to give them a kicking, have done it, and will look at them again because they've not fundamentally got a lot of confidence with the government. I think they've got rather more work to do than that, and that they're not just going to bounce back into government almost as of right.
Who do you think is going to win, finally? Who do you think is going to win?
Well, I'm told, and everyone repeats what everyone else says, that Kemi Badenoch will win the leadership contest, but we don't really know. Certainly I would expect her to do better in London and the areas surrounding London. And London, of course, does tend to make the conversation. And although the Conservatives are thought of as being a kind of elderly, rural and provincial party, I reckon something like a fifth of the membership is in London.
Why do you think she'll do better in London?
I think London is more prepared to take a chance on the Kemi Badenoch gamble working, and that it may be that Robert Jenrick's fairly conventional, sort of cut and dried right-wing appeal just simply goes down better with voters who've been members for a long time in the sticks, but I don't know.
Whoever wins, there is no doubt that the Tory party is moving to the right. But the danger for them is that their diagnosis is basically the same, that the Conservatives must be truer to themselves, that in a sense the electorate is craving a more authentic version of Toryism. For all the talk of hard truths and big thinking, neither Jenrick nor Badenoch seems willing to confront a very real, potential alternative reality, that the public strongly disliked the Tory party because it was far too much like itself already, and that it had failed on everything that mattered most to them, on the economy, the NHS, on public services, and for all the talk of first principles, and for all the talk of hard truths, neither, so far, on any of those things, has much to say. We'll be back just after this. Right, from one bunch of political oddballs to another. Joke. Next week we are kicking off the newsagent's US coverage. I'm going to be trying to find myself a proper tinge of Trump orange in Florida, reporting on the transformation in that state's politics and the countdown to November the 5th. John and Emily will be sticking around for the budget, but heading stateside after that as well. It is all getting very exciting. Thanks to our production team on the newsagents, Natalie Inge, Rory Simon, Shane Fenley, Michaela Walters, Georgia Foxwell and Arvin Badawal, and our new executive producer, Louis Dagenhar. Our editor is Tom Hughes, and a big special thank you to Aggie Chambray, Katie Ball and Paul Goodman for giving us their insights on today's show. It's presented by Emily Maitlis, John Sopel and me, Lewis Goodall. I, for one, say go Gators. We'll see you on Monday. Have a lovely weekend.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.